Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Looker webinar series. Today's webinar is on an introduction to Looker API. I'm really excited to talk to you. It's kind of core to pretty much everything we do at Spectacles is using the Looker APIs built on top of it. Josh and I have used it for a long time. And so we're excited to kind of either start you on your journey of using the Looker API, or maybe it's a refresher for you, or you know it quite well and you're looking for some more advanced stuff. Whatever it is, hopefully there'll be some really key things around the Looker API that you'll be able to take away today. Before we jump into this, I just want to highlight our upcoming webinar. So if this is the first time you're joining us, we do these every 2 weeks, typically this time on a Wednesday. They're not really about Spectacles or us as a company. They're really just an opportunity to talk Looker with people who use Looker, get everyone together. Sometimes they're presented by us, sometimes they're presented by our partners, sometimes they're presented by just customers of ours or other companies that are using Looker in the space. So in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about how you optimize cost and speed using BigQuery and Looker together. So we're really excited about that. That's what the team at Do It, and that'll be 2 weeks today. And by the time that webinar goes live, we'll have announced a new slate of at least 2 or 3 webinars for the weeks after that. If ever you want to register, so if you want to register for that one or want to keep an eye out for ones in the future, head to spectacles.dev/webinars. You'll be able to see them all there, and you can get registered and make sure you don't miss them. And even if you aren't able to make it, if you register for them, we'll send you the recording after the fact. And so that's a good reason to do it as well. Additionally, if you want to go and look at any of the prior ones that we've done, they're also on there. We provide the recordings and the slides for all of our webinars, and so you can see them on that same page. And then the final thing before we kick off is who are we? So my name is Dylan Atlas-Baker. I'm joined by Josh Temple today. We're 2 of the co-founders here at Spectacles. For those of you who may know the name Spectacles, but don't really know who we are a continuous integration and automated testing tool for Looker. So we help developers make sure their Looker instances are bug-free, that they're able to develop quickly and effectively, that reviews happen efficiently, and really just find all the bugs in an automated way very quickly for you in your Looker instance. And we have started this company a couple of years ago, having had 10+ years of combined experience developing LookML and administering Looker instances. We've both been in-house. I've been a consultant for a number of years, and I've seen Looker instances big and small at a whole range of companies. And we'll be kind of pulling on that experience today as we talk to you about what you can do with the Looker API. The final thing I want to talk about before we jump in is the Slack channel that many of you have just joined. That's where the Q&A questions should be asked. So there'll be an agenda, which I'll introduce in a second. But after that, Josh and I will typically have 10 or 15 minutes to answer questions on the topic. And if you can join the Slack, that's where you can ask questions. You can kind of upvote other people's questions with emojis, and it's where we'll pull the questions for that. So I will drop that in the chat one more time, because I can't remember if it shows you the full chat when you join new, but you can join there, and there's a channel there called Webinar Looker API Introduction. So let's get into it. We're going to cover kind of 4 broad topics today. The first is, what is an API? Kind of agnostic of Looker. You may know the term, likely you do know the term, but you might not know exactly what it stands for, or how they should be used. So we're going to quickly kind of cover that, really not in the context of Looker, but really just what an API is. We'll then move on to what the Looker API itself can do and how you can use it. We're then going to talk about the API Explorer, which is a really interesting way built into your Looker instances to learn about all of the things you can do with the Looker API and to test them out really easily. And it's a really nice gateway if you're just kind of getting used to the Looker API. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Josh, and he's going to talk about how you use the Looker SDK and do a live demo and kind of build something out to show you practically the types of things that you can do with the Looker API and how we would write a script that does so. Perfect. So let's jump in. What is an API? So an API stands for Application Programming Interface. And all that means really is it's an interface. It's a way to interact with a service. It's a way to get information, update information, interact with some form of service in a programmatic way with some form of code or kind of programmatic request. Most web services that you use in your day-to-day probably have one, even if you don't know it. If you're using something like Fivetran or Stitch or Airbyte to pull data out of a service and put it in your data warehouse for Looker to consume. What all those services are doing is they're interacting with the APIs of whatever data source you're trying to pull it from, Salesforce, Google Ads, anything like that. They built an integration with that API so that they can pull it and put it in your warehouse for you. And most web services that you use day to day likely have one. There's another term that you'll hear come up a lot, and we're going to talk about today when it comes to APIs, and that's an SDK, a software development kit. And what an SDK is a kind of language-specific abstraction of an API. And so what that means is most APIs you make a web request, an HTTP request to, and you can do that in all programming languages, but often people will write a wrapper for that. So instead of you kind of remembering the URLs and knowing all that stuff, they'll develop what's called an SDK so that you can get to using an API basically more quickly, and so that in the code itself you can get things like type in. So it'll also help you develop with that API more effectively. Looker has an SDK for their API, and Josh will be showing that later when he jumps into the demo. So just as an example here, this is actually the Stripe API, which we use in the back end of the Spectacles hosted service. And so what you can see on the left-hand side here is the code that you might use to query something from the Stripe API using the Stripe SDK in Python. And so what you can see, if you're familiar in Python, is we import the SDK, we then define our API key. Most APIs like this will have some way to authenticate with it. Looker is no different. We'll show that later. But you basically need to provide something that allows you to tell the API, this is who I am and this is what I'm allowed to do, or this is why I'm allowed to do the things that I'm requesting. And then that fourth line there is just saying, hey, go and get me the information for this specific customer. And so what that will do is it'll retrieve the information, which typically will be structured something like what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which is a JSON response. And so that's what the SDK looks like. This is at the top as a slightly different endpoint, but this is what it would look like if you're doing it directly in curl with the API. And so the difference here you'll see is you need to know the specific URL for it, and there's kind of a slightly different syntax for how you provide the key and how you provide the data. You can do both of these things. You can do things right against the kind of raw API endpoints, or if there is an SDK for whatever service you're trying to interact with, you can do it like this at the bottom half of the screen. For context, we actually do something closer to the top bit when we interact with the Looker API when we built Spectacles. There's a whole range of reasons as to why we did that. We can go into those maybe in the Q&A. But we don't do it with curl. We make requests in Python, but we don't use the Looker SDK. We kind of do something akin to this where we're making the request to the specific endpoint that we want access to. So that leads us to what can the Looker API actually do? We've kind of talked about APIs in the abstract, but what is it that the Looker API was built for? What is it that you can do with it? How should you use it? The very short answer to what can the Looker API do is kind of like almost everything you can think of, whatever you want. It is a really well fleshed out API. I mean, Looker is a very big tool, and the API itself aims to do pretty much everything that you can do in the UI and then some more. So the API for Looker is built and gives you a whole range of abilities. And so that, I give a couple examples here, can be things like creating users, deleting content, running queries, updating dashboards. But really, anything you can think of, or almost anything you can think of, you can do with the API, whether that's moving content from one folder to another, whether it's disabling users, whether it's configuring a new model or anything like that. You can do that with the API, and that kind of unlocks a whole range of possibilities depending on your exact use case. So most people, in our experience, if you're using the Looker API, is to write some type of script to handle some repetitive task. Many of you may just may do predominantly LookML development, but some of you may administer Looker instances, and kind of whatever wherever you are on that spectrum, there's likely some tasks that you do that you might be able to automate in some way using the API. So for most people, the primary use case for the API will be, scripting things that makes your day-to-day life easier. As Josh is going to show later, that can be something like plugging all users who haven't run a query in the last 14 days and sending them an email. But it can also be a way to, offboard a user more effectively, updating their schedules and all that stuff. Typically, these scripts will be anywhere from like 10 to 100 lines, and we'll do a range of things that you want using the API. And that's basically what we're going to show you today in the demo. And that's the scripting using Looker API is really how Josh and I got started using the API. We were in-house, wanted to make our lives easier, and we both happened to be on small data teams, and resources were tight, resources were constrained, and if we could free up our time from some of the repetitive tasks using the API, that just made us better at our jobs, gave us more time to do the other things as part of our roles. There's like a second category then of things that are built with the Looker API. And these are more advanced use cases, typically building kind of a whole application or a whole service or a command line interface using the API. And so examples of that are something like Looker Deployer, which can be used to move content from one Looker instance to another. Spectacles, the tool that we've built that provides kind of automated testing against your Looker instance. And then Henry, which some of you may also have heard of or used, which provides a bunch of diagnostic information around content that can be deleted, content that's not being used, explorers that are being under-queried, things of that nature. And so typically, you'll kind of start through a more narrow use case, develop your familiarity with the Looker API, and kind of expand things from there. So let's say you've followed everything I've been talking about so far, but you haven't used the Looker API before, and you're thinking, well, I'd really like to try this, and I want to kind of like dip my toe in using the API. Looker out of the box in your Looker instance provides a really nice way to do this. And it's a tool called the API Explorer in Looker. And so the API Explorer is going to look a lot like what you see on the screen here. And it's a way to both see all of the endpoints that are available to you in the API, and provides information about those endpoints, and then also allows you to test them without writing any code directly in your Looker instance. And so what you can see on the screen here is we've got a section over to the left that I'm in the user section, but that provides all of the different endpoints that you can use. And there's probably a couple hundred of them. Probably a couple hundred of them. And you can kind of see all of them. You can search for them. You can click one by one through them. And so here I've highlighted get user by ID, which returns information about a user when I have that user's ID. And so then you can see here, sorry, I need to stop touching my mouse. You can see here the endpoint that both the SDK method that it refers to and the URL for the endpoint. You can see a bunch of other information. And then I think most interestingly for most people, there's a run it button here that unveils this section on the right that allows you to test that API endpoint. And so without writing any code, you can put a user ID here. You can select the subset of fields that you want to receive, and you can click run, and you can see against your instance very easily exactly what response you would get, what response that API endpoint provides. And so if you're just getting started with the Looker API, this is definitely where I'd recommend you start, both from a fact-finding point of view, just seeing all the things that the API can do, but also as a means of easily testing these things. Josh will show this a little later, kind of being used. So if you want to start with the API Explorer, it may already be enabled on your instance. If it is, when you click the hamburger menu in the top left, you'll see an application section, and API Explorer will be underneath that. If it is not enabled and you've got the right permissions, which is probably admin on your Looker instance, you can actually install it easily. And so the way to do that is first to click in the top right here on the what I think of as a banana stand from Arrested Development. But you click on the banana stand, which takes you to the Looker Marketplace, and then you'll see a screen like this, and it'll prompt you to click on the API Explorer, and then you can install that. If you don't have the right permissions, speak to an admin on your Looker instance who should be able to install it for you and give you access. once you're there, as I said, you'll click on applications, you'll click on the menu, you'll click on applications, and you'll have access to the API Explorer. And it really is, even when we're prototyping, it's often where we'll start. I'll go in and, inspect the structure of the data that gets returned, a whole range of things like that. It's a really, really good place to test this out. And because you're logged in when you do it, you don't need to do any of the kind of authentication handshakes that you're going to see Josh do in a second, which is necessary once you actually start developing with it. But it kind of gets through that first barrier and it lets you kind of get a feedback loop from the API really, really quickly. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Josh, who's going to walk you through a live demo of how you can actually use the API.
Cool. Thanks, Dylan. Actually, we don't mind putting that slide back up just for a few more moments. So thought we could do something, just a quick example to show how we would use the API to build something interesting. This is something I built at a previous company. We basically had an Airflow job that would hit the Looker API once a week and look at all users who had been inactive. And by inactive, I mean they hadn't run a query in Looker over some number of days. And then it sent out an email to all of those people at my company, basically just asking them, how are things going? Because sometimes people are stuck because they can't figure out how to do what they want to do in Looker. Sometimes people just don't know that it exists or they've forgotten. Sometimes, people just actually don't need Looker, as it turns out, in their job. So this was a way to trim down our licenses, but also just provide people a better user experience. So we're going to build all of this except for the Airflow part. We're not going to do the email. We're not going to do the the scheduling, but at least we'll do the part that pulls the data from Looker, formats it into this message with the dynamic fields input. So to do that, we're going to start actually in Looker before we even get into the API. So Dylan, you can actually kill the share now, and we will hop in here. Oh, and I've just been logged out of Looker, so give me 1 second to log back in. So at a high level, what we're going to do here is we will start in the System Activity Explorer in Looker. If you haven't used the System Activity Explorer, it's really, really cool. It's basically information about how your Looker instance is being used. So for admins, you can see things like who is querying and who is not, among other things. There's actually tons of information that it exposes. So we'll start in the System Activity Explorer, and we will build that query to find out which users haven't been using Looker, haven't queried in a while. Come on. Okay, I'm in. Okay. All right, thanks for bearing with me. So this is the System Activity Explorer. You can get here from the Explore menu if you have the right permissions. So you'll see under System Activity here on the left, we're using the User Explorer. I'm going to zoom in a bit. And so we basically just need to grab a few fields. We're going to grab the name of the user. We will get their email. And then we're going to get the most recent query date, which is a measure that tells me the last time that they ran a query. And then I'm going to add a table calculation here so that we can turn that date into a number. And we're going to do diff days, the most recent query date until now. And we will call this days of inactivity. So we run this, we should get a list of users in our Looker instance, and then the number of days that they've been inactive. And I'll just go ahead and filter out people who, in this case, haven't run a query at all. and we're going to make a look with this. The reason why we need to make a look is because while we could just actually launch this query directly from the Looker API and get the results back, it's just a little easier to save it as a look. Then we can just run the look and it's predefined. So we'll save that. And we could imagine, we might want to message Dylan and Baker or Dylan and Sarah here to let them know that they haven't been using the tool and see what's up, see if they maybe don't need their Looker license, etc. So now that we've got this data, we want to be able to pull it out of Looker. And so like Dylan said, the API Explorer is a really, really great way to just prototype without having to worry about authenticating to the Looker API, generating an API key, trying to figure out like what the data structure looks like when it's returned. All of that you can just do right in Looker. So like Dylan mentioned, once it's installed, it's just a matter of going over here to the side menu, opening applications, and clicking on API Explorer. And so here we can search for different methods. You'll see there's a method section and a type section. The type section is generally things that are returned by the Looker API. And the methods are the actual endpoints that we can use to make requests to the Looker API. So I know I've got a look. I know I want to like get the data from it. So I'll just type in look and see what happens. There's a lot of different ones, but there's actually a section for look down here. And we want to do run look. It's a little different than get look. Get look is sort of like return information to me about the look. Run look is execute the query and give me the results. And so some of these are better documented than others. The more popular ones are pretty well documented. Some of the more esoteric ones, you might be scratching your head at to what exactly they do, but typically you're going to find some information about the endpoint, and we can see there's different result formats that we can return here, which is cool. This is, you might initially think, oh, this must be our like SDK code where we can run this. This is actually the code in the Python SDK that executes this. So generally, I actually don't use this section declarations very much. Usually, if there's examples, you can click into these, which can be helpful. And then down here, you can see like if it's a valid response to the 200, what does the result look like? If it's not, a bad request, what does the result look like? Sometimes this can be helpful for debugging why you got one of these errors. Looker is, I know, actively working at getting better at what those error messages look like. But the main thing I want to show you is this run it button, which is kind of subtly up in the corner here. This is really where the magic happens. So Looker knows that I'm logged in as my user, so I don't have to authenticate. I can basically just take the parameters that I would otherwise pass to the Looker API, and I can put them in here. And so we can run the look. I'm actually going to use one I created earlier, which is look number 5. And then we need a string, which is one of these result formats over here. So we'll just return it in JSON for now. And everything else is actually optional, but we could tell it to rebuild PDTs or use cache results or all sorts of different things. So when I run this, it just does it. Like I don't have to make any web requests. It's just done. Here we see the exact information from the look with our names and emails and the table calc and measure returned as well. So already super cool. Like in just a couple seconds, I was able to use the Looker API, see how the data would be structured if I wanted to write code based on this. It's like very easy to inspect. And I could go back in and say, maybe I actually want CSV data instead of JSON. And now I've got a nice little table here. And then the last thing that's cool about the Looker API Explorer is there's this tab called SDK call. So here I can actually, depending on what language SDK I'm using, looks like we don't have C#, Swift, and Go yet, but if I'm writing a web app and I want to use TypeScript, I can just copy this code. If I'm writing something else in Python, I can copy this code. So this is also really useful, just immediately zoom in to the exact code that you would need to run this in the SDK. So this is the API Explorer, use it, it's amazing. The other way you can get to this page that is useful is developers.looker.com. You go to developers.looker.com and click API up here. You can see under interactive reference, it's actually the same thing. But the nuance here is you're not logged in as yourself anymore. So if you do choose an endpoint and you click run it, you have to actually, it'll ask you to log in and configure. So definitely recommend just going through your Looker instance and doing it that way. All right, last thing we're going to do together is do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it in a Python script that allows us to generate that email template. And so anytime I'm doing something out of the API Explorer, I need a way to tell Looker who I am. And so that's what an API key is for. An API key is a username and password that says, I'm Josh Temple, and you can trust me with whatever permissions I have in Looker. So I'm just going to generate a new one so I can securely delete it later after this webinar. And we'll need this information. But before I jump into that, let's just get a folder set up here in Python. So I've got a folder created. I always recommend anytime you're doing anything in Python to use pyenv, and particularly pyenv virtual env, which is a long-winded way of saying that we want to create a kind of isolated environment where we only install the things that we need for this project and nothing else. So I'm going to do that here before we get going. And I'm going to use Python 3.10 here, and I'm just going to call it webinar SDK. Cool. And then I'm going to activate that here. There we go. Okay. And I will open this up in VS Code. Once I'm in VS Code, I'm just going to create a new Python script, call it fetch.py. And VS Code has recognized my virtual environment here, which is great. So now we can actually install the SDK. And depending on which language you're installing the SDK for, there'll be different instructions. Those are all in the Looker docs. But for Python, it's pip install Looker SDK. And I'm actually using the old environment. We switched to the new one we just created. That way you see exactly how it would look. Okay, so we'll install it. And now we can start writing our code. In order to use the Looker API, you basically need a way to provide the API credentials to the SDK. And the way that works with Looker is they ask you to create a file in the same directory that you're in called looker.ini. And this basically holds your client ID and client secret that are part of your API key. The reason for doing that is you always want to avoid adding client IDs and secrets to version control. You don't really want that information to leave your computer because you don't want anyone else to get that password. And so we will just take these, and the format for this file, you put Looker client ID equals, I'll paste that. We'll grab the client secret as well. And then we need to provide one more parameter, which is the base URL. And that's basically just, in our case, it's spectacleslearn.cloud.looker.com. You can find that by just literally grabbing this URL. The difference is if you are on a .cloud.looker.com, you just take the URL as it is. If you are on, if it was like spectacleslearn.looker.com, we would need to put port 19999, which is just the port of the API. Don't worry too much about that. It's all in the instructions for using the SDK and creating this file, but just for some reference, you're going to need the base URL, the client ID, and the client secret. You could also put the client ID, client secret, and base URL in environment variables. So if you're deploying this somewhere, or maybe you just don't want to deal with this file accidentally ending up in version control or something like that, you can also use environment variables, and Looker has docs about what the syntax is for those. Okay, so we have everything we need now to actually write our Looker SDK code. So we can just import it. And something that Looker SDK gets, I won't get into all the details, but there's a kind of a code gen process where like a master schema generates multiple SDKs for different languages. What I've noticed is that the kind of IntelliSense that you get in VS Code when you hover over things and you can see exactly the parameters that are required in types and stuff gets a little messed up with the way that the Looker SDK gets generated in Python. Something I like to do is import from API 4.0 .methods, import the actual class of the Looker SDK. It helps with helps VS Code understand what types things are. So we're going to create our SDK. The way we do that is Looker SDK.init 40, which is just API version 4.0. It will find the Looker ini in my current directory, so I don't actually specify that. And then I'm just going to type into here, which is useful now. Now VS Code can kind of understand the different methods that exist on this type and suggest things for me. And then we can go back to the API Explorer and grab this code that, oops, that's the wrong one. Grab this code here, because we know this is what we want to use to run the look. And I can just paste that in. We've already got an SDK, and we know we want to run look number 5. Actually, I'm going to put it back to JSON, not CSV. And then because this, I'm going to call this result string. This is going to return a JSON string, and we want to actually use the information in that return JSON. I'm going to import the JSON library from the Python standard library, and we'll just parse that into a dictionary so we can interact with it. And you can see, this is typing in correctly now. This is a string. We're going to load it into this will actually be a dictionary. And we can just stop there and just make sure this all works and print it out. Hopefully I have set up everything correctly here. Let's try it. Cool. So you can see this is the same data that we were getting in the API Explorer. We've got the different users, the information about them. And now what we want to do is we want to iterate through these different users. We want to look at how many days they've been inactive, and we want to write a little message to anyone who's been inactive, let's say 14 or more days. So I'm going to actually copy some of this in. This is my template string. So it basically is just a big long string with various points where we can inject formatted information like their name, their email, crudely grabbing their first name here by splitting on a space and taking the first one, and then the days of inactivity. So these are the variables we need to sort of come up with in order to populate this email template. So let's do this. Let's loop through each user in the result, because we can see down here, this is a list where each user is their own entry in the list. And we'll just grab, Copilot is trying to help me out here. We'll just grab the relevant information. This one we know is actually not user, it's not keyed on name, it's actually keyed on user.name, so I'll make that change. And email as well. And then now our template has all of the things that has all the variables it needs to populate it. Now, we actually don't want to email people who, in my case, the Josh Temple user used Looker today, so we don't need to email them. And we can just skip over them. So we will do if days of inactivity is less than 14, just put a continue so that we skip over those users. So this should only generate emails for the people who have been inactive more than 14 days. Let's try it out. Oh, I have to print this. Cool. And so with just a few lines of code, we've been able to generate these pseudo-personalized messages to Dylan and Sarah saying, hey, we noticed you haven't used Looker in X number of days. We skipped all the people who have used Looker. And then we could find a way to send these emails out, which is actually the harder part of this, is figuring out how to schedule this and send the emails out and stuff. But this basically just goes to show you how powerful the combination of creating creating looks and tables in the governed Looker data model, and then using the Looker API to flexibly access that data and do cool things with it. Like the sky is really the limit. And I should also mention, because we've type hinted our Looker SDK, we can see, you know, what were all the extra options that we could have provided here. So I hope this like gets some ideas going for you about ways you could use the API to do interesting things. I mean, kind of go above and beyond just basic BI of like charts and graphs, but actually send information to people, meet them where they are, and do creative stuff. And you know, kudos to Looker, because they, for many years, worked hard on building out this API to cover as much of the functionality as they could in a public context. That's pretty unusual for a software product to have such great coverage over what you can do with the API. So it's really just asking you to be creative and come up with cool things. I'm going to just quickly look through the questions now. And Dylan, maybe you can help me do that.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with one that was asked by Tina Carr, because I think it's a kind of a nice follow on here. Tina asked, let's say I want to track the data lineage of a specific Explorer and all of the dashboards it's used on. Do you know if the Looker API could handle this? And I don't know off the top of my head, but this is a great case to use the API Explorer and just quickly see what we could find. So we probably want to start with something like dashboard. Or actually, since we're already at look, maybe we just start there. If we look at get look, which is going to tell us all the different information about this look, we can see that down here, what's returned from the Looker API is this look with query type. Oh, I collapsed it. So we can scan through here and think, well, does this give us anything we could use to figure out lineage somehow? And I don't immediately see like explore jumping out at me, but what I do see is query ID. And query ID is going to reference the underlying thing that the Looker API is running. And I happen to know that we can get a query as well. So we can give Looker the query ID. And let's see what this tells us. And so we can see here that it's going to return the model as well as the fields. And those fields will tell you basically the view qualified name or view qualified dimension names and measures that are used in that query. So, again, I'm not saying that yes, this is definitely possible, but like at least from that, I have an idea of how we might tackle this. We would get the look or the dashboard tile. We'd fetch the underlying query. We'd look at the different fields that make up that query, and then from there we try to build out some kind of sense of lineage between explorers and dashboards and looks and charts like that. So yeah, the Explorer is like really a great place to start, just diving into what could be possible. But I'll hand over to you, Dylan, now if you want to read through some of the questions, and we can take turns answering or whatnot.
Sure. Yeah. So that was the first one by Tina. We got one from Jono who says, is there any rate limiting on the API? If lots of developers are hitting endpoints simultaneously, could that drag performance on the Looker instance? I could probably answer that one. There's a handful of endpoints that are rate limited, but they're basically ones that are open, like ripe for abuse. It's like things that create background jobs and stuff like that. And I think there's like a handful of them where that's the case. Otherwise, your instance has 200 threads, and you're unlikely to. So I think they will limit you at that point, but you're unlikely to get to that. And the reason I say you're unlikely to get to that is in Spectacles, which we run like as many API calls as we can simultaneously when we run some of our steps, and we have only in the we actually don't get rate limited, but there's no performance degradation. Occasionally you'll get a 500 and you'll just need to retry, but there's no actual performance degradation on the Looker instance, at least in any of the, we've tested this pretty broadly with all of our customers, and we're yet to see a performance issue on the UI side as a result of this stuff going through the API. Going through the API.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is that it's still using Looker under the hood, so you can still slow things down by running too many queries, or you could, if you're on Redshift and you have too much going concurrently, like there's still ways that it could slow things down, but it's no different than how you would slow things down using the Looker interface itself. There's no the load, it's all load balanced. There's no rate limiting on the actual requests from the API.
And there's a follow-up to that, which says, similarly, is there a good way as an admin to keep track of API usage by each API key, for example, in order to monitor BigQuery costs? I don't know the definite answer for this. I think there's an activity, a system activity explorer that shows you API requests that probably has a user key on it. I may be wrong, and that's definitely something I can follow up on in Slack. But I think there's an explorer in there that is requests or API calls or something like that. I may be misremembering.
API usage, yeah.
API usage. So I think that has a record for every request that goes through. And I assume there's a user key on it, though, Josh, if you're looking at it, you can confirm that.
It actually doesn't look like it. It looks like it's just date, endpoint, and usage. So you'll have to explore and let us know.
Yeah. Moving on to the next one from Alex. Can this also be used to see which dimensions measures haven't been used in a query over a certain period of time? The answer there is yes. There's actually a tool called Henry. I alluded to this earlier. That'll do at least a version of that for you. If you search Looker Henry, you'll find it. But we've actually been building something like this as well in-house. So the API itself won't give you which fields have been used, but you can use the System Activity Explorer that does show field usage and kind of break it down from there and then map it to your dimensions and measures. So it's not like it's not the most straightforward process because it's not like there's one endpoint where you get, hey, these ones are being used, these ones aren't. But what you can do is run that query, and then you need to do a bit of data munging. And also on the API side, like pull every model, pull every explorer, pull every field, and then map the usage up to every field that exists. And part of the reason for that is because in the report that you run, the the thing that makes it up is the queries that have hit it, that hit Looker. And so if a field hasn't been used, it won't even be in that report. And that's why you need to kind of like join it on to the models and explorers and dimensions that you get from the API. So it's a slightly complex process. Alex, if you are interested in doing that, we actually have a bit of code that we've been working on to do this. So may be able to both help you out there or kind of you may be able to help us test some things that we're working on there. So definitely follow up there, or we can if there's any interest there. There's two. Sorry, Josh, one for you here. Would there be a scenario where you would only use the API endpoint directly versus the extension framework with the API? And I don't know if that does mean extension framework or means SDK, but assume it does mean extension framework. I'll hand that off to you.
I mean, I can kind of answer both because I know the other one was also alluded to earlier. I think the extension framework is a way to build applications and often like interactive UI based experiences on top of Looker. If you're not using that, or you just need to do something that's more back end, like what I demoed today, chances are you're probably just going to use the Looker API. And I would imagine, aside from people like consultancies and companies that are like building these big applications and experiences on top of Looker, most typical BI developers are just going to use the Looker API by itself without the extension framework. And then I guess to answer the other question, which is like, when would you just make raw requests to the Looker API versus using the SDK? My recommendation would be to use the Looker SDK. When we first started making spectacles, the SDKs were very new. I think they actually were announced like a few months after we'd started working on spectacles. So we actually opted to build essentially our own Python SDK. It does kind of the same stuff, and it just allows us to do more, like to dig in and hook into deeper parts of things like error handling and retry logic and stuff like that. So I would say for most people, you absolutely should just use the SDK until it doesn't work for you. It'll just save you a lot of trouble.
There is a question, Josh, about what about securely providing API credentials? If you host a mini app or regularly schedule a script to run on the cloud, would you recommend setting up OAuth authentication instead of environment variables?
Yeah, so I know Looker does now allow authenticating to the API with OAuth. That's certainly, good if you need to act on behalf of users. Like if you're building an extension framework, you're building some kind of extension or application where somebody needs to authenticate, give you permission, authenticate as them and say, you can do X, Y, and Z with my account and my access, then that's a case where you definitely want to use OAuth. For a lot of kind of like backend stuff where you're just building a script to run in the background, probably just using the API key is fine. It's not, unfortunately, not like super secure to just have a client secret just hanging out somewhere, or like in a database, or on a server or something like that. So you have to be careful about how you store that client secret if you're building a production grade application. But generally that's the way that I would kind of think about it, is like you're just building quick and dirty script to do something, you can use the API key. Otherwise, OAuth is a good way to go if you're acting on behalf of other users. And I guess I think maybe this was already answered, but add on to Asif's question, there's some places in Looker where it shows API 3, like edit API 3 keys. Looker's on version API 4. I think that's just like they never updated the UI, or maybe API 3 means something different. But don't worry if yours says API 3 keys. Everyone says that. It's just we all use API version 4 now.
If you have written anything that is using the 3.0 or 3.1, it is, I think, technically now deprecated, and so you should move, like, your instance will almost, unless you're on a very old instance and you're self-hosted, your instance will support API 4.0, and we'd recommend using that for anything that you're writing today.
It's also not much different, so pretty easy to migrate. It's like very similar.
Yeah, I guess for everyone, we upgraded Spectacles from 3.1 to 4.0, and it was basically just a find and replace across the code base. And I'm not sure a single thing broke or changed as a result. If anything, it was very minor. Got one more here. If you want to do a write back feature where a user enters a comment on a dashboard and then write the comment back to a BigQuery table, I did this through data actions calling a cloud function that does the insert. Is there a better way to do this by the Looker API process? Yeah, sure. I may need some more context there. I don't know what that dashboard comment is, but there may well be a way to use the Looker API for that. But if you provide a bit more context there, we may be able to help out. If we run out of time here, we can do it in Slack after the call. And I can see a couple people typing, so I'll give it a second to do that. The one that I will answer is what VS Code package, Josh, were you using to help code in Python? You mentioned Copilot. It was Copilot, but is there anything else there that you'd recommend for people doing this type of development in VS Code?
Yeah, I mean, VS Code is great. And I would say maybe it comes stock installed now, but like the Microsoft Python extension to VS Code is called Pylance, and it provides tons of type checking and like on hover information and stuff like that. So definitely use that if you're developing Python. Probably most people are. And then I was using Copilot. I'm just playing around with it. It's pretty good and feels fast. Helps me like block out code much more quickly. So +1 for that. Just to quickly hit Yasha's question, I think doing that feature via data actions is probably a pretty good one. Like being able to respond to something that changed in Looker, you probably want to use an action and an alert or something like that. And then, certainly Looker API is not going to be able to do the BigQuery insert. So feels like a reasonable approach. But I'll give it some thought after as well and follow up on Slack. And Jeff's asked, do any endpoints require pagination or endpoints allow for modified datetime sort or filter?
There are a few.
What's that? Yeah, I think certainly some of them do, but I've also gotten some enormous responses back from the Looker API, particularly like around the LookML model and Explore one, where it tells you all the information about your explores and models and dimensions inside of them. That can be a huge JSON document. So, but sorting and filtering sometimes. I would say my impression of the Looker API has been that like some endpoints are very high quality and some are pretty half-baked. And so depending what you're trying to do, you may be like totally satisfied with your ability to slice and dice and like only return certain fields and things like that. For other endpoints, it might just be kind of, you're getting like a dev level access.
There's a bunch of endpoints that start with the word search. So there's like search dashboards, search looks, search folders. Those are the ones I know where both there is pagination on most of them, and you can do more of this like created date type filtering and sorting. I actually don't know of others, but those are the ones in particular that I know have a lot of that logic, and you kind of set a limit and a page ID, and you just iterate through them that way. Perfect. I think that is where we're going to call it today. We've actually run over a tiny bit. A couple of things I just want to call out before we lose all of you today. First off, thank you very much for attending. The attendance for all of these, this is our fourth of these so far, has been really great. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover, or you'd like to cover, or you think we can have someone else cover, please let us know. You can message Josh and I directly in the Slack that you've all been in to ask these questions. We'd love to work with you. Maybe if there's something that you want to talk about, really, if you have any ideas, let us know. The next one of these webinars, I'm just going to drop the Slack link again. A couple people asking for it there. The next one of these is in 2 weeks, as I talked about. So head to spectacles.dev/webinars to sign up for that. We'll hopefully see a number of you there. And then before that one, we'll have announced a bunch more of these. And then the final thing I want to talk about is many of you will have attended our webinar 2 weeks ago, which was actually on linting. That linter is about to go live. But if you are either a customer of ours and you're interested in testing that, drop us a message. We'll set up a call with you to get you set up and run through it. But equally, if you are not a Spectacles customer, you've never tried it, and you're either interested in the linter, which is coming out, because that matters to you, you want to enforce a style guide across your instance, or maybe you're interested in Spectacles as a tool, you want to improve the developer process in Looker, you want to speed up pull request reviews, you want to provide automated testing and reduce errors in your instance, just let us know. You can either book a demo through our website, or as I said, Josh and I are always really happy to chat. So just drop us a message in Slack, and we can go from there. That's it for today. So thank you to all of you. Josh, thank you. And we will hopefully see all of you in 2 weeks for the next one, and in Slack in the meantime. Thank you very much, everyone.